Hello everybody, this is about repairing the HiFi power amplifier block which dies quite often. Most of these supplies, the fault is the power supply. Out of 99% it's the power supply, and only one of them had a fault elsewhere. So to save yourself thousands of dollars, this is how to fix it. Probably about $120. To protect the circuit board underneath from getting dust and damage and crap off the bench, I just put down a piece of paper to keep it clean and the circuit board clean underneath. So basic tools are required, just cutters, a multimeter of some sort, and wire strippers, of course, a soldering iron. And I must say that you're dealing with mains here, in other words the 110 to the 240 volt. If you don't feel confident with that, I'd get someone who is competent working with mains, because you just have to be very careful in the wiring and making sure everything's well insulated inside. But I'll get to that. It's very simple. I've done about 30 of these and it's pretty straightforward. What you'll need is a Meanwell power supply, 24 volt. It has dual outputs on the end. It's a beautiful unit. It's the 150 watt 24 volt supply, part number RS15024. These are available at any of the component suppliers for electronics, and they're probably available all around the world. Meanwell is a very popular company of this particular switch mode power supplies. That is the 24 volt supply. That will fit in here. And the other one is the 5 volt supply, which is exactly the same, as just a little tiny one. This is a 5 volt little supply, also available from Meanwell. It's the same brand, and this will fit here and replace the damaged supply inside. So I'll commence and show you what's inside, and we'll see what happens from there. Now, because I'm lazy, I'm going to use the power drill just to remove the screws. Now, some of these units have an additional screw depending on the age of the unit. So you put that aside. Here is the dead board. There's the multi-pin connection here. This is what we're going to deal with. So the supply is dead and heads for the recycling electronics bin. This main supply is 2-pin. You can put a new 3-pin in if you wish. It is insulated inside, so therefore it generally doesn't require an earth. That's up to you. How you get the mains into there is up to you. I'll just show you. I generally keep it quite simple, but we'll take it from there. First of all, we need to remove the multi-pin connector here. This one here is the 5 volt supply. These 4 wires here, and that's the little that comes out. And this is the 24 volt supply on a big plug. Two separate plugs. So what is interesting is that these are all paralleled, soldered on the board underneath. Why there's many cables here is beyond me. I don't know why, but it's very handy because the 24 volt supply has 2 supplies built into this unit, so that makes it very convenient to change over. So what I'll do is now hack all this off, and I'll continue and show you. Now we move the board. That's how easy the board is. So that now is headed for the tip. There we have our new, just collect all your screws and make sure everything's sorted, and make sure none of the screws have fallen down the slots onto the internal circuit board. It's a good idea to shake it and make sure all the screws are off the circuit board. So what we're going to end up doing is this goes in like so, and the 5-volt supply, that's the 24-volt supply, and in here goes the 5-volt supply, and they sit neatly in here, and that will go on the top. So there you have it. That's what it will look like when it's finished with a new power supply. The writing on the board confirms everything to you. Closely here you'll see it has STB on the inner black, ground, 5-volt, 5-volt. So the inner wire on the plug that is closest to the centre is a no connection. The one that says STB, just cut it off and discard it, which is, as the plug fits in, comes off. So what we'll do is discard that one, and I usually put a loop in it or cut it short so I won't use it. Then the others are, unfortunately these aren't colour coded. The 5-volt supply is not colour coded. On here you'll see on the plug, the two closest to me are the positive of the 5 volts, and the other two are the negative of the 5 volts, but it's clearly marked on the board here, so you can't go wrong. It's much easier with the 24-volt supply because of the colours are red and black, obviously positive and negative for the multi-pin. So long as you get the 5-volt correct, there shouldn't be any problems in getting this sorted here. So that really is the end of that board. We don't need it. So we cut the two outer ones off first. These are now the two positive wires. So what I do is twist them together to make sure there's no mistake. And what I will do is place a bit of red tape on there to make sure that I don't get them mixed up. To stop confusion in the wiring, I mark the wires so that there can be no mistake as to which is the positive of the 5-volt rail. So just a little bit of something to indicate. You can use whatever colour you want, whatever's in the shed, just to identify the two positive leads. And the other two that remain are the negative. That's the end of that. So I put these together. So that's the negative rail, and we wire strip these. And we join them together. So here we have the positive and the negative of the 5-volt rail for the small 5-volt supply. The 24-volt supply is really easy. I cut all the wires off close to the plug, as we'll never need the plug again. Just gives you plenty of cable. Hack them all off. So here you'll have a massive red and black supply. So I just sort them into groups. So you basically want two outputs. So there's one, there's 4 of them. So you just join them all together. So in 2 lots. So you'll see the first lot is parallel, and then the next. But essentially, you just divide it up in half. So you put the reds in 2 lots and the blacks in 2 lots. So what I've done is, there's 8 reds, so you'll see on one half there's 4 and the other half there's 4. The same for the negatives. So that group of 4 is one half of the power supply, and then you've got the other 2, which is the other group of 4, and then here you have on the outer side the 5-volt supply, which is these 2 here. And fortunately on the power supply it has 2 positives and 2 negative rails, these are just connected onto here, and the 5-volt supply is extended round to the back. So I'll continue to do this and then I'll show you what happens. Mounting this is a little bit weird. It sort of nearly fits. It's the supply is just a fraction large, but I wouldn't get too stressed about that. You know, the other thing what we'll do is I'll solder these and we'll test the board that lights up to make sure that it's not one of those dud ones. So here we go. I'll just solder all these cables together. Okay, make sure there's no bits of stuff in there anywhere. So here we have one 24-volt supply, the second 24-volt rail here, and there's the 5-volt one, which has got a little bit of tape on it. That's the positive and that's the negative of the 5-volt rail, the 24-volt rail, and then she's all ready to go. To secure this, the 24-volt supply, it's a little bit messy in there, but it really is not that matter, as long as it's secured when the lid goes on, because it goes in a cupboard, sits in a rack, it doesn't move anywhere. Once it's back into the rack, into the home, it doesn't matter. But a bit of double-sided tape underneath, just to sort of secure it in position. Velcro or anything you can use, that's fine. It's nothing too fancy. So we peel those off. Oops. So you put it as close as you can up to the wiring, and you'll see it just sits in there. It's not going to move anywhere. So we're ready now to terminate the front. So let me just do that. So we've got 2 positives on the right side. So you've got 1 positive rail, 2nd positive rail, then you've got the 2 ground blocks. They are common underneath, so it's not a big drama. So that is just the 24-volt supply on the end there. Now this is the mains here, this is the 240-volt. So I wouldn't attempt this sort of job unless you're just working with mains and being very careful. So we extend the 5-volt round to the supply at the rear, but there it is secured inside with the 24-volt supply done. We will do the primary of the mains, I'll do that last. So now, the 5-volt supply. Much the same thing, it has a protective cover on the end, because you've also got on the end of here your 240-volt or your 110 coming into the unit. So there's a guard for all that sort of for mains cables here. So always be very careful working around mains, and I wouldn't attempt this if you're uncomfortable with it. Get somebody who's used to dealing with 240-volt or 110 just to be safe. Okay, so this is going to fit inside here, which is it's so simple. Now, there's a couple of things here. These, I call it a juggly, but I think it's an EIA cable. That has to fit in from the inside here for your mains. But wouldn't you know it, it's slightly too large. So there's a little bit of fiddling, just a little bit of filing around here to get the new plug to fit. Now, if you're very clever, you can actually remove the one that's on the board and use that one instead. So that is only soldered on. So what one can do is, this is often easier. This is a solder sucker. I've had it for about 30 years, right? So we can remove the 2-pin plug, and that will fit perfectly back onto the frame for your main supply. So I'll do that now to get this board out of the road. So right, so here you have the original socket, which removed off the old board. That board is now useless. So for the 5-volt supply, we need cable. So what I do is usually wreck an old scrap of mains cable, which is clearly identified as your neutral and your hot for the 240 volts for the supply. There we go. So there we have our 2 pieces of hookup wire that will make our main supply. So at the end here you have your live and neutral clearly marked. In Australia, blue is neutral like the sky, and the brown is the hot cable for the 240 volt. Tin these. You don't want any daggy bits that could have possibly short or get connected to anything. So the blue wire goes into the neutral. This is our active live cable for the AC. Secure firmly. So as you can see, there's the mains and the 24 volt supply. This little pot over here is to trim the voltage to 24 volt once it's under load, but it's not a big deal. Okay. So I twist these. So this neatly tucks around the side here for us to deal with the 240 volt, or the 110 goes down, and we'll terminate all that at this end when I do the 240 volt here as well for the 5 volt supply. So there we have, that's the 24 volt supply now is done, finished. So now we work on the 5 volt supply. So here we have our positive and negative 5 volt supply. So for the 5 volt supply, I've got a scrap of old cable here, but I've got a red and a black, which differentiates it from the mains. In this case, I know it's the 5 volt supply. With the 5 volt supply, I put heat shrink over it when I do the join with our 5 volt rail. So look, you can use a little junction block and put in there, like a little small junction block, as long as they won't short to each other, and but the heat shrink is the cleanest way of doing it. So we cut ourselves off a couple of lengths of heat shrink. We can slide that on afterwards if we want, so we can. So the red one, on our red one, obviously that's our positive rail. And the black for our negative rail. Nice tidy job of that. So what we can do now is we squeeze those tidily and we slide the heat shrink down the cable over the join. Ta-da! Oh, there's the other second one. So the heat shrink over the join. So there we have our 5-volt supply that will go off to our little transformer at the back. As you can see, they will just tuck neatly down the side here. So you've got your 240-volt mains and your 5-volt supply going to the rear, where we can now set up the 5-volt supply in here. And the extra length here will also be the power supply for the little 5-volt supply. So we connect the red and the black to the 5-volt rail on our little supply here. So there's our positive. And our negative rail is next door. And the middle's the earth, and then we have our mains on either side here. So we're going to, there's our 5-volt lines all in place. The mains, so you cut it so that you're going to secure it here onto the socket. So that's about the right length. And bare those. The other two bits, the spare pieces, will be the 240-volt or the 110 supply to the 5-volt supply here. Twist that. So, once again, we've got our 5-volt main. So, blue is the neutral, like the sky. Now, I bring the mains in from the top of the wiring so that there's no chance of it touching the bottom. So, and make sure it's not too long. And that fits under the washer there. And then the live one on the outside is a little bit long. Right, so twist those together and make sure there's no burry bits or any fine wires touching the chassis. Obviously, this is why dealing with mains, be very careful not to be a grub in these areas. Okay, so that will fit back in there. Right, so now we can secure the socket for the mains to go on here, okay? Right, now this is the difficult part. This particular brand in Australia is just ever so slightly too large. So it just needs a little bit of a file on either side to get it, and it has to fit from the inside, otherwise you can't get the outer case on. So it has to fit from here. So I'll just file a little bit off each side to get it to fit. So the centre pin is the earth, which we're not using. And if you look inside here, it'll tell you the active and the neutral. So we'll do the neutral first. Nice big pot of solder on there. It's a bit awkward to get at, but we'll try and get it in the right position to solder, to solder. Great, so cut off the excess so it's a nice tidy secure join. Same for the active side. So that's basically it really. So now we now look, depending on your country you can run the earth, but it's an isolator, and you'll see the earth on each one. You can run an earth back to this pin, but because these are isolated anyway, it's not a big deal, and the original one wasn't earthed anyway, so that's up to you. So this goes all back in here, and we get our screws that we've saved with our little washers to put it back in. So there we have the socket mounted, the socket in the frame. Now what can happen here is that you can run a flying lead into the 240 volts and avoid the socket. Look, it's in a cupboard. Isn't that important to muck around and grind all this down? Or you can salvage the old socket off the old board, but I broke it, so it's all too hard. So, and you just secure it that any tagging on the wire won't pull on the circuits, on the connectors here. So all of this is basically going to be in working order in a few seconds. We tidy things off. There is a little cover here that goes on the supply here, just to make sure the terminals are all secure. Bit of tape on the bottom of this one. Just to stop it floating around till it gets into situ. Peel a bit off its, and that sits nicely there like so. Tied it all up. The 240 volts is exposed here, so obviously be very careful in testing. Make sure there's nothing of the low voltage is touching the mains. So basically it's finished. All done, all nice and tidy. This is the big moment in your life where you plug it in and see whether it works. So here we go. Double check everything. Everything's secure. That won't move. You could always put a little bit of insulation tape over the connectors just to make sure, over the mains, particularly in Australia because it's 240 volt. Okay, our 3-pin. And the big moment, we turn the power on. And she's lighting up. There's a little green light right under the power lead here. When that comes on, ta-da, you're in luck. We can do a quick voltage check here. Look at that, 24.2 volts. Perfect. If you're really fussy, you can trim the pot till it's exactly, I think it's supposed to be 24 or 25. It'll go up to 25, which is exactly what it's supposed to be, according to the board, 25 volts. A 5-volt rail. Perfect, 5.1 volts. So she's all going perfectly. That's fine. Now is to get the computer and we check the audio outputs that they're all working. See, there's nothing actually causing any issues. And that'll run very cool. So what we've done is we've put the lid on so that there's no fingers around any electronics in here. Plugged it in, the little indicator lights on here, we've plugged it into the network, which is on the which connects to the laptop for the HiFi2 app, the controlling app for the system. We had an audio source here I've got a CD player, so we shove that in, number one, and we have a speaker connected to one of the leads, and we try that, and hopefully when we play something it all should work. So there you go, completely fixed. And you can go along with the computer and check each successive output as you go all the way down the chain. But I've never had any of these faulty. None of these have died. It's all worked properly. So we unplug it all. There is your fully finished network for about, I suppose about $150, probably max, Australian dollars. So, and that is now ready to go back into your installation, and happiness all round.